What's up YouTube? Capital G here, checking out the brand new Doremichord archetype that just got revealed coming out of Ancient Guardians, our next deck building booster set. The archetype is very unique and interesting, although not as crazy as I thought. I thought it was going to be like a Pendulum archetype with just one monster, and it was going to let you Pendulum summon from like your deck or with one monster or something crazy, because Konami has a history of doing that. You know, look at Eldorado and Sky Striker Invoke. They just have one main deck monster for the most part. But yeah, the archetype, and it's interesting because the scales are kind of all over the place. You have everything from 1 to 7. The levels, the attributes are also all over the place. This archetype is fairy based. A lot of people wanted spellcaster, but you know, you didn't get that, unfortunately. And then you also have some pendulum scale effects that are interesting, because basically this archetype is all about like being able to pendulum summon and your opponent not being able to stop that. The high scales don't allow your opponent to negate your pendulum summons, and then the low scales don't allow them to respond to them. So, you know, your opponent can't solemn you. They can't use things like torrential after you've already pendulum summoned, which is kind of cool. The levels are interesting, and they correlate directly with the pendulum scale. So basically, the low level monsters in this archetype have high scales, and then it also inverses, where the boss monsters have very low scales but high levels, obviously. Aesthetically, the archetype looks beautiful. I mean, I'm talking Madoche level of cuteness, although I'm not exactly sure if they're supposed to be magical girls or just like girls in a music class. I don't know. You guys let me know. Anyways, we're going to break them down. I am not going to read these damn cards because they're pendulum cards. I'm not going to read a scale effect and a it's just too much. Anyways, let's start with Qdia. She's your level 1, which means she has a very high scale of 8. And she is the Stratos of the archetype, where basically your normal summon her, you get another Doremichord, and you know, it can't be herself, but whatever. It says that she gives basically your Doremichords some additional attack based on if you have an even scale in your pendulum zone, which is kind of nice. Maybe if you have multiple of her, like that'd be kind of cool, because then you can really boost your monsters up. But some of the high level monsters in this archetype already have pretty good attacks. This is probably going to be a 3 of, because Stratos and Yu-Gi-Oh! Being able to search all your monsters is obviously a good thing. The next card is Dreamia, and this is a solid extender for the archetype, where basically just kind of a free summon. If there is any Doremia card in your pendulum zone, you get to just special summon this card from your hand. This is why, man, like obviously a Link monster would be so good for this deck, because, you know, you start with Qdia, search Doremia, put, you know, activate a scale, then just freely summon the Doremia, go for like a Link 2, pendulum summon them both back. Like that would obviously be like a really solid combo. So basically you're just using her as fodder just to get a monster on board, not have to use your normal summon. Seems you know, pretty good. Now, some of these cards do have monster effects that give you protection. For instance, she protects against like you know, your Doremia cards that would be destroyed by card effects, but you have to have an odd level scale on your field to trigger that. The next one is a Lydia. This one, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think this one's that good. So this is the one where if it's normal or special summon, you get to target a spell or trap your opponent controls, bounce it to their hand. I mean, if you're going second, that can be fine, but obviously going first, it does nothing, because your opponent won't have a card on field. So I don't know if I like that. Her second effect, her second on-field effect is also really not that great. It's if you have an even scale, you take no battle damage from battles involving Doremias, unless you really feel like your opponent's going to put a wailing on you with like Boral Sword or something like that. You know, I wonder how useful that's going to be, unless your life points are really low. This was the first card where I looked at it and I was like, I don't know if you need to run this unless you really need her scale. Her scale is a 6 and she is a level 3 monster. But yeah, I didn't really love her. When you get to Fancia, Fancia is fine. Fancia is like the first card that has some decent attack value. 1600 for a level 4 monster is not bad. Her scale is 5, and during the main phase, you get to take a Doremichord Pendulum monster in your deck and put it in your face-up extra deck. So that's perfectly fine. Like, obviously, that just makes for stronger Pendulum summons, or potentially a starter. Like if you don't have, you know, Qdia, you can just put her in your extra deck and then Pendulum summon her out, and then obviously activate her effect. So I looked at that and I was like, yeah, that seems pretty good for, that's a good effect for basically any Pendulum archetype. And then She has an effect that gives you battle protection if you have an odd level scale. So, just a little bit of battle protection. When we start getting to the high level monsters, again, that's when these scales kind of inverse and we start getting to the lower scales. And the first one is going to be Gracia. Gracia is a spell and trap searcher when she is summoned. Now, the spells and traps of this archetype are not particularly strong. I actually think they're pretty bad, but obviously there is room for improvement. Like, it can only go up from here. And generally, I don't know, as a control player, anytime I see, add a card on summon, like, it just inherently makes me think the card is pretty good. So, being able to get a free +1, it's going to be good. Plus, eventually they'll get some strong spells and traps. She is, with the high or with the low scales, you start kind of getting like Armades type effects, or at least with the next couple of cards. This one, when your Doremichord monsters attack, your opponent can't use any monster effects until the end of the damage step. That is actually quite useful. I mean, that type of effect has always been good. You're talking about monsters that you run them over and they trigger. I mean, there's a lot of those in Yu-Gi-Oh! Floaters, we basically call them. Being able to lock your opponent out of that, very solid. Angela is okay. Angela lets you summon from your deck. So during your main phase, you contribute a Doremichord Pendulum monster, and you get to special summon one from your deck with a Pendulum scale that's 2 higher or lower than the attributed monster. That can obviously go into some combos. I can't think of them combos off the top of my head because this archetype just got revealed today, but generally summoning from your deck is probably going to be useful, especially in Pendulum, where when you tribute the monster, it goes to your extra deck, and then ideally, you want to just freely summon that monster back from your extra deck. So that should be very useful. And then she has the same type of Armades effect, except instead of covering monster effects, she shuts down spells and traps. Last couple of monsters are your really high level monsters, which of course have low scales. This is where you start getting into the really high attack monsters. Qdia has 2,500 attack, and she has a quick effect where you can target an effect monster your opponent controls, and if that monster leaves the field, you banish that monster. So that can probably be very strong because, I mean, decks generally don't like when their cards are banished, with maybe the exception, no, not even Virtual World. Just generally decks want to keep their monsters on the field. So, if your opponent is playing something where they're going to synchro summon, at the very least, you get to, potentially banish your opponent's monster. It would have been better if you would have just negated that monster's effect instead of just banishing it. But, whatever. Basically, it's like, we have to take what we can get. This is kind of like the first, I would say, disruptive effect of the archetype that really kind of hurts your opponent during their turn. Her second effect is, it's kind of like related to the damage step as well. When you battle a monster that has lower attack or attack that's equal to or higher than the lowest pendulum scale in your pendulum zone, you can destroy that monster. So it does give you a way of outing bigger monsters. Coolia is the boss monster for Doremichord, and she's nice, but the fact that she's level 8 could be problematic for this deck. I say that because the scales cap out at level 8. So unless you're going outside of the Doremichord archetype, I don't see any way for you to pendulum summon her. Now, her first effect addresses that because it allows you to tribute 2 pendulum monsters to special summon her from the hand, which obviously is nice. And, with Qdia, you can kind of get the 2 monsters quite easily just using your normal summon. With this archetype, her next effect is like, I don't want to call it a disruption effect, but it does negate cards, so that's kind of cool, where you can target a face-up card on your opponent's side of the field, you can negate that card, and then if you have an odd number scale, you can negate 2 cards instead, and you negate those cards until the end of your opponent's next turn, which is really good. If it would have been a quick effect, I think this card would have been absolutely incredible. It would have been a world beater. It would have been obviously their best piece of disruption. You do have a little bit of disruption on this card. I wouldn't consider it the best. Very similar to Qdia. Like, it's nice, but it's not exactly like great. And that is, if a monster activates its effect and that monster has attack that's less than or equal to 300 times the highest scale, you get to destroy that monster. So again, the kind of the problem, at least with the disruption cards of this archetype, is the fact that they don't negate the monsters before they activate. Like, yeah, you get to banish your opponent's effect monster or destroy it, but your opponent is still pulling off those effects. This is another way, in my opinion, that this archetype can load up its extra deck. It's just, I really see this deck struggling with getting those cards out of the extra deck. Like, this archetype's really going to have to link summon to like pull those cards back. And I get in the OCG, they'll just default to like Electromite, but in the TCG, we don't really have, I don't know if we have like a great link monster that this deck will go into. So they'll probably just have to play anything. When it comes to some of the spells and traps, we have a few of them, although, as I said, I don't think any of them are particularly great. Your normal spell is going to be Doremichords Scale. This one lets you activate effects in sequence based on the number of Doremichord monsters with different names on your field. I mean, there's 3, 5, and 7. 7 is incredible because it just nukes your opponent's entire board, which has always been good in Yu-Gi-Oh! And will always be good. I don't know if you're going to ever get 7 on the field because that's basically the entire archetype. 5 lets you summon a Pendulum from your hand, which is fine. 3 is probably the most achievable effect, and that returns a card from your Pendulum scale to your hand, and then you get to place a Doremichord monster from your extra deck into your scale. So it's kind of basically like a little bit of a swap out. That's probably a solid effect, but I just think, man, the 7 looks so good, but like, how are you pulling that off? You have to have, there's 8 monsters in this archetype. You have to have 7 of them on field to pull it off. I don't know if I see that happening. You got a field spell, of course, because everything has a field spell. And you can activate any of these effects as a hard once per turn. You can add a Doremichord Pendulum monster from your face-up extra deck to your hand. That's nice. It's not a Rhoda, but I think Konami didn't want this archetype to be the same as every other archetype. You can have one Pendulum, or you can have a Doremichord in your Pendulum scale, gain scale equal to its level until the end of the turn. So Pendulum scale modulation, I guess. And then if you have 3 or more Doremichord Pendulum monsters with different names that have odd scales or have even scales, you get to destroy 1 card your opponent controls. So that could be an effect, like maybe that can be a free +1 every single turn. I think you're probably going to be adding from your extra deck to your hand in most turns, especially, I guess, to reuse Coolia. Like if she dies, that's a good way of recycling her since you can't Pendulum summon her. Musica is your first trap card, and this is kind of like a potential extender and or disruption card. It summons from your extra deck based on what type of scales that you control on your field. So if you have an even scale, you get to summon an even monster from your extra deck, and if you have an odd scale, you get to summon an odd. If you have even and odd number scales, like multiple monsters or I guess multiple cards on the field, then you get to target a card your opponent controls and pop it. I would have liked to see this card as I would have liked to see a little power creep added to this card. Like I would have liked to see either it be a quick play, or I would have loved if this could have been activated from like the hand. That would have been really good, where you could just like draw and instantly like pop a card. I kind of get maybe why Konami didn't want that, because you can use this in the battle phase, and the monster that you summon, it can attack, and it doesn't have to be summoned in defense mode. And those are things that Konami has kind of gotten away from. So this is nice. I just think it's kind of slow. I think it would have been really good if it was a quick play, or it would have been significantly better. They have a counter trap that doesn't negate. That triggered the hell out of me. I don't get it. It's a hard once per turn. It's a counter trap that doesn't negate. Like, what is that? So this one gives you protection. If your opponent activates a monster effect, a spell, or a trap, which I was like, oh, it's an Infernity Barrier, and then it's just not, you can make your Pendulum monsters unaffected by that opponent's effect. You can make it so that your Pendulum scales cannot be destroyed, or you can make it so that your Pendulum scales cannot be banished. Why is this not an Infernity Barrier? I mean, if you want to argue, Cap, they don't just want everything to be Rhoda and Infernity Barrier. Like, I got that, but why would you make a counter trap that doesn't negate? Like, what are you doing? I don't know, man. I think this archetype needs a Link monster badly, but I'm not going to undervalue it, because archetypes like Sky Striker did not look very good when we just read them on paper, and then, that archetype was like bananas. So whatever you guys think of Doremichords, you leave that in the comment section below. I'm interested to see what people think about this archetype.